Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Conversations on Species Credits. My name is Doug Bruggeman, and I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, who's sponsoring this series. And we specialize in developing economic incentive programs for sustainability, and much of our work is centered on species issues. So this is the second installment on the Zoom series, and I want to thank Travis Henman of Westerville Ecological Services once again for providing a great kickoff last month, outlining the history of habitat markets and ideas for moving forward to create more functioning markets. So we are recording these talks. So if you missed Travis's talk, you can log on to our LinkedIn group and catch his talk there. So the emerging theme as I speak with folks about the forum is the tremendous hope for these markets. I mean, frankly, we really need these species markets to work. And that's why I felt when I started a graduate research program in species crediting back in 2001, and the faculty were really not supportive. But luckily I had my own fellowship and was able to push forward on that. And the other theme is the dire need for clear regulation. So today we're very lucky to have Wayne Walker of Common Ground Capital to dive deeper into these issues and pathways for moving forward with regulation. And next month, we're excited to have Victoria Colangelo talking about the intersection of policy and credit sales. And in May, we're going to have Jake Lee of EPIC discuss their policy recommendations for the Biden administration for species mitigation. So really grateful. There's been really good energy building for the series. I think many people feel like we need to have different conversations about species credits to move it forward. So with that, Wayne is going to provide a brief presentation, and then we're going to hopefully enter into a discussion. So during Wayne's talk, if a question comes up for you, please type it in the chat and mark publishing to everybody on the Zoom chat. And then we'll get to those questions after Wayne finishes. And then after that, hopefully opportunities for more organic discussion might come about. Hopefully you guys should be able to unmute yourselves and a discussion will evolve. And so as before, I will keep track of the questions and share that with others to help build this discussion and community moving forward. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Wayne.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. Can you enable me there?
Yeah, let me just make you the host.
Great.
All right, there we go. Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, it's an honor to be here today, Doug, and don't know all of you here on the Zoom, but we're probably all mitigation nerds, and hopefully you'll see some value out of this discussion. Today, I'm going to talk about what I think we're going to really need to get these species markets on a sustainable, positive path. We heard last week that there are some problems with them. I obviously concur with Travis. Our investments and our time in these markets have had mixed results at best, but we think there's a positive way forward. So I think there is some hope. Conservation needs more money, and we're all aware of 30 by 30. Unfortunately, we're talking about the last 30%, not saving 100% or even 80%. And we got there in large part, in my view, is because we don't have enough money going into conservation, and we don't, with the exception of these markets, some of which aren't designed very well, the private sector for-profit investment that goes into the very things that causes the impact, the next subdivision, the next, energy project, what have you, that model for the most part has been kept off the field in recent history, with the exception of wetlands mitigation was a success. So this rule, I think, will get us to where we are in wetlands. So we got to have new money for conservation, and I'm going to talk about how we're going to get it. So if you don't have a roadmap, it takes you a while to get somewhere. And the challenge with species markets is it's really just based on policy. And so you do have an underlying ESA law, which creates the regs, but the guidance to make the mitigation part really functionally sustainable is all we have. And although we tried to get some good guidance a few years ago and unfortunately got terminated, we're relying on guidance that is 20 years old, and we really have no definition of mitigation in the ESA. And so we don't really have effective regulations. And with guidance, there's a lot of well-intended experiments out there that occasionally produce successful examples, but mostly, unfortunately, it's unsuccessful examples. We need to have regular production of these many examples and make them all successful. So this is kind of a variant of a slide I've shown for years at land trust meetings, all sorts of financial forums. People wonder, why is conservation losing? And it's pretty simple. Through programs like charitable easements, Farm Bill, Pittman Robinson, et cetera, we put in thousands, millions, and arguably, I know Farm Bill, we technically put billions, but it's a very, very, very tiny part of the money that flows through our economy relative to traditional development. Drive down the edge of your town, you'll see a subdivision being built. Probably nobody paid anything for those ecosystem services that were lost. Drive down Main Street America. You will not see a biodiversity bank, but you will see a lot of banks that are there to fund things that most of which aren't great for conservation. Energy sector, of course, ranchettes, fragmentation, it goes on. And all these things happen because when it comes down to a private landowner and that person's got to make a decision about what to do, conservation usually can't pay because it's not market based. So you have to have a big green heart, which a lot of people do, and we should be grateful for that, but that's not enough to stop the economic vehicle that causes impact these landscapes. If we get this right, just like wetlands, I think we can bring billions of dollars into the species space. So we have some occasional hit and miss results. Why do they happen? So when mitigation is attempted, it's usually part of a very high profile, highly contentious decision with a lot of political pressures. And we can all look at something in our backyards. For me, it's the prairie chicken. For the folks out west, it's a sage grouse. In the Midwest, it's bats. West Coast, it's vernal pools. We've all seen the challenge in our backyards, and it's full of political fodder and a lot of folks who just don't do this a lot. So when we get to mitigation, what happens? There's really no legal requirement to use professional mitigators, and there's really no even guidance requirement to use professional mitigators. You get a lot of options, a lot of ideas to use by people who really have never done it before or haven't done it much. There's only a few banks, or there's no banks in that particular market because of the uncertainty. And there's always a possibility of starting an in lieu fee program because it's perceived to be easier, and there's people tend to wait to the end of these highly contentious things. They need a solution right now. And industry, of course, loves in lieu fee because it caps their exposure to price discovery for the resource. Some examples, and these are from region 2 and 6. I'm sure other regions have examples. The American burying beetle. I would say it's a success. It's not perfect, but I would say that, if we use the things we found in the American burying beetle and use that lesson learned and take those lessons and place parts of those things into a rule, I think we'll have better outcomes. For the beetle, after the in lieu fee program failed in about 2012, the service got really smart. They came up with one standard for mitigation. It was required in the HCP, what they call ICP here, required of all mitigation providers. They came out with species-specific guidance. They got a lot of strong investment quickly from the private sector, and they got strong conservation results. And after 6 or 7 years, we got another 10,000 or so acres on the board that really hadn't had any new acres on the board besides some things done on Native American lands and things that are already there for decades, Army bases basically, quickly. And that gave the service some flexibility to contemplate a downlisting. DSL, not so good. You had a Texas Conservation Plan, circa 2011, 2012, you know, the standards weren't really complete. You had a false start. It was so bad that the Texas comptroller ultimately legally gave up the plan, terminated the program. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Lesser prairie chicken, again, well-intended effort by a lot of folks without a lot of experience, came up with an in-lieu fee program. The service allowed there to be competing standards, banking standards for the chicken, and then standards created by WAFLA, which is more of a conventional in-lieu fee program. Very minimal oversight. A lot of bank investment stranded. The best places ultimately weren't allowed to participate. You had, after the delisting, AWHILE participants quit paying the fee. And so the fee crashed. Mismanagement all around, and also non-compliance on the part of the WAFLA stuff. So just to emphasize that, you know, this stuff is all very thick. Happy to get into some of the details and questions, but the plan today is not to get into the weeds. So again, ABB, one standard, strong investment, strong conservation results. You know, downlisted last year. These are the front pages of the oil and gas industry conservation plan and the American burying beetle mitigation guidance. Again, got a lot of acres on the ground really quick. We actually reassembled some ranchettes, both ourselves, our competitor. You had all these little ranchettes in eastern Oklahoma. We were able to recreate those, manage those as one landscape. So you had a really great conservation gain. DSL, again, incomplete standard, false start, half measure as a second attempt. So, you know, back in 2019, the comptroller retired the program. As you can see in the Austin American Statesman, a lot of pushback by the oil and gas folks and the political folks. CBD sued. You know, hats off to Texas comptroller. They really took the high road because it wasn't working. It wasn't legally defensible and it wasn't good for the species. They terminated it, so industry lobbied successfully to artificially revive it. And now you have a new alternative to cover other industries like sand mining and some of the renewables folks under a hand-picked administrator by the oil and gas industry without really full remedies. More on the Texas comptroller. So this is the kind of letter you don't want to see, right? And these are the kind of letters that tend to happen in these in-lieu fee programs, and they ultimately fall off the rails. You know, you had the comptroller Hager sending a letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service director saying, you know, we're done. And some of the things that were highlighted, not only in this letter, but in consultant reports and other correspondence, low enrollment letters under TCP, 3 times more habitat impacted than was enrolled and mitigated. You know, they didn't anticipate the mineral state being stratified. And if you aren't from this part of the country, what that means is that mineral rights aren't just as simple as what's under the surface. If you have complex areas like the Permian Basin, you know, somebody may own the mineral rights from 0 to 5,000 feet. Somebody else may own them from 5,001 to 10,000 feet. So you've got to account for the impacts that happen for all those different levels, not just assume it's simple and one person or group of entities own all the minerals from 0 to infinity down. Confirmation measures weren't effective, and the litigants, you know, have now filed notice to sue. Enrollment in TCP suspended, the program's now gone. And a new CCA Hurley approved in January. Lesser prairie chicken, again, competing standards, mitigation standards versus range-wide plan WAFLA standards. No oversight effectively. Bank investments were stranded. In-lieu fee participants stopped paying after the lesser prairie chicken was delisted in 2015, and you know, non-compliance as we've seen through multiple third-party reports. You know, the plan was, the range-wide plan itself wasn't a bad plan in terms of population goals, restoration goals. The problem is they didn't meet any of the goals, and they didn't, the mitigation framework was disconnected. So they, even though it's supposed to work with the banks, it couldn't. Well, they didn't want it to. And I had a lot of committees, you know, people were trying to be inclusive. That's great. But again, most of those people had not developed mitigation before. So here's the fix, in my opinion. You got to have requirements for regular production of many examples that are all successful, and you got to have a rule to get there. Guidance, although well-intended, is subject to interpretation and is not the rule of law. So what we're advocating for is clear, consistent rules that will attract investment, okay? Because if investors like us and others know what the rules are and nobody gets a special deal below those mitigation standards, investment will come. And this could help ward off listings, or at a minimum, it will help get a lot of conservation on the ground quickly, as we saw in the beetle, which could give the service more flexibility for downlisting or delisting later. This also helps establish, all this helps establish advanced mitigation. A single mitigation standard for all species will apply to all banks, all in lieu fees, and all applicant responsible projects, or what we call PRMs. Clearly defined types of mitigation: preservation, restoration, repopulation, where appropriate. Preference for fulfilled credits, or we call advanced mitigation. If somebody's willing to invest in conservation to the standard as required by the service, and also as required through the various permit options, you need to reward that investment, because that investment proactively is helping to solve the problem. And then finally, clearly define approval process. And in my region, I think the service has done a pretty good job of getting various permits and banks approved very quickly. But you hear stories where it can take an exceedingly long time. The rule needs to be simple, but not simplistic. These are complicated things, but you can't allow the complication to cloud what we need for an outcome. So you got to have mitigation standards developed for each species based on the conservation strategies for the species up front. You can't allow the first person in the door to have what they believe is a great idea or a agenda to do something that only focuses on cheap and quick but not effective conservation to be the ones to define it for everybody, and then everybody else is required to stick at a higher standard. And how do you get that initial program that's not performing off the field to the detriment of all? Standards need to be developed by an inclusive, collaborative process subject to notice and comment. You got to have consistent crediting. The definition of a credit and use of ratios will have to be justified as you define the mitigation standard. The placement, number, and size and adjacency of mitigation areas should be determined to achieve maximum strategic benefit for the species. You can't, again, you've got to define what the species needs, the conservation strategy or even a recovery strategy, then define what the mitigation standards are to meet that. Here's an example of what could happen or what could have happened. So if you look at the lesser prairie chicken, here's all 4 ecosystems on top of the chat map. And if you look at the dark red or the burgundy, so, the range-wide plan was supposed to have 1 stronghold of 25 to 50,000 mostly contiguous acres in each ecosystem. And this was a 10-year goal, and we're now into year 8. And we don't have any. And so what we did, even before the range-wide plan came out, we knew from talking to the service, and we knew from the people on our team where those high-quality areas were. We were aware of the stronghold strategy as a keystone of conservation biology. So we went and got the good stuff. And if you look at the blue outline areas, and I apologize, it's a little small on this map, but if you look here and here and here, we went and got all the good areas, right? And then WAFA's program, which was capped, the prices were capped, which is often happened in the feed programs. They cap the price at a rate that they think they can deliver the conservation later for, and they find out that they can't. And then you get in these difficult situations that they're tough to unwind. So, WAFA didn't secure any property in strongholds. I mean, our biggest holding here, tiny holding here, up here, over there. This is the problem, right? When you try to cap the amount of money that's going to go into conservation, it doesn't work, right? Because you're dealing with a scarce resource. The landowners, most of these parts of the country, are fairly sophisticated folks. And, you go to them, you talk ESA, they freak out. And ultimately, you have to pay a market price for them to allow their operations to work consistent with these conservation banks or mitigation programs. that's not going to be some sort of cap price or some percentage of appraised value. So, you know, we have all the private sector invested in all the right areas, but due to a lot of reasons, you know, we weren't able to have a functional market with WAFLA. The good news is we're now, through the support of the service and others, we're developing our own habitat conservation plans that specify development of strongholds as a major priority. So how are we going to do this? We're going to look to wetland mitigation. Over the last 5 years alone, wetland mitigation has created $5 billion in investment to restore wetlands and streams. It's a mainstream investment for people. If you talk to sophisticated investors, you know, many of them have heard of wetlands, but none of them have heard of species banks. So we got to use that rule. I think Travis talked about this last month. You got to refine the expertise of the mitigation industry and the conservation community to get this done. And, you know, we need to present the service with a compelling, nearly complete draft rule to jumpstart the public rulemaking process. So hope y'all are interested in this and will join not just me, but you know, our industry and other folks in the conservation community. We hope to share this with soon, and love to get into this in Q&A. And if you want to talk more about it after this, give me a call. That's all I got, Doug.
All right, Wayne, thank you so much. That was great. So we don't have any questions right now on the Q&A. I will highlight for a moment that this is a rare opportunity to speak to an industry leader on species credits. And so you can also unmute yourself. And if I might just start, Wayne, I tell you, I'm real curious to learn how the Fish and Wildlife Service is allowing an HCP to come in with lesser prairie chicken now. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for the service. There might be some service people on the phone, but look, here's the reality. We tried to work things out with not only WAFLA and other parties for years and years and years, because, you know, being administrator of the permit is not something that I thought I would be contemplating when all this started more than 8 years ago. But we've got a lot of experience working with HCPs, with the industry folks. We've got a great consulting team that helps us on this in West. And it became obvious that the only way for us to have a chance to not only monetize our credits that would help get the conservation goals of strongholds and restoration done as envisioned by the range-wide plan, but also for others in the future, was somebody had to step up and do this, because, you know, we knew that, or we learned that the Enviros had filed litigation. The judge set a date. I mean, you just have to look at the calendar and go like, nothing's going to happen unless we lead. And so we worked with the service very diligently and developed this HCP. And we've actually got two of them, Doug. We've got one that's going to cover renewables and transmission infrastructure and communication towers. We've got another one following it that will cover oil and gas for folks that either did not participate in the WAFA program or are no longer eligible, or, you know, whatever their issue is.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's a great example of, you know, finding that leadership opportunity and building those relationships to make it happen. And I think, you know, that was also part of Travis's talk, was oftentimes these markets, when they're successful, they reflect a personality.
Yeah.
Right. And we need guidance to get past that.
Well, yeah, I think we need a rule to get past it. I mean, the guidance has helped, right? I mean, like, you look at, you know, like the beetle, the guidance was almost effectively as effective as a rule. You had a couple, we had more than a couple. You had a group of really smart people in the Tulsa office, and you had some folks, and still have some folks, it was a different crew back then, in Albuquerque that, you know, a lot of them come from California, to be honest, and they understand it. And, you know, when that beetle thing went off the rails, they said, look, we got to take these lessons learned and get these standards in place. And, you know, there's always going to be a little whiner from industry, and they're our customers and we love them. But, you know, once it was there and it worked, you know, the whining kind of stopped, and people appreciate the efficiency, and they certainly appreciate the fact we got a lot of conservation on the ground, and ultimately helped give the service latitude to down list.
Great. So an example of communicating the forward process that allows closure, and then that generates support. So we do have a chat coming in here.
Great. I think.
Touch on the subject of endowment, if they're required, and if so, how is the amount determined, and what do regulators require as far as monitoring it? As you can see from my question, my frame of reference is mitigation banks.
Yeah, and let me look at the chat to make sure I'm seeing the whole question. Yeah, so endowments, key part of it. You know, we as conservation bankers wear the long-term performance risk. The service has gotten very savvy on, you know, what parameters need to be considered in developing an endowment. It's something that we may want to look at the rule, because there's a fair amount of latitude in the endowments. And what we've done is kind of the traditional, you know, third-party endowment, use a par calculation, look out decades and decades and decades, put everything under the sun in there it takes to run the bank, everything from what's gasoline going to cost in 10 years to how many ATVs to, you know, how many biologists are we going to have to fund, how many acres we have to burn, you know, on and on and on and on. Very complex models. We worked with Sherry Teresa, who helped develop the PAR tool years ago. She's fantastic. And, you know, that's how we determine our endowment amounts. The other endowment amount that's included in that PAR that we do is, you know, you've got to give your land trust partners in financial incentive and sustainability to monitor these easements. So they get their endowment separate from the master endowment at the time we sell credits. You know, there's other endowment vehicles being considered out there right now, insurance, other sorts of performance bonds. That stuff's really interesting, and we should look at it. But we just got to make sure that when we're defining mitigation standards for a species, that's not always left wide open, because the cost of those different assurances can be different. And those options, of course, are very complicated and involve a lot of financial analysis.
Great. And then another question here, do you have ideas or examples for non-habitat mitigation? For example, ideas for captive rearing and augmentation reintroduction?
Yeah, it's a good one. You know, a lot of strong opinions around this. I think that you have to look at what the species needs. Doesn't work for things like lesser prairie chickens or grouse, as far as I understand. But you look at things like condors, growing chicks, reintroducing those to the wild. You know, you talk to some of the biologists and say it works. So I think you just got to look at what the species needs. I'm not going to try to go down a list and say what works for what species. That's for the biologists to determine. But out of kind could work, but we have to make sure out of kind is not used as an excuse to just buy cheaper mitigation or do research in exchange for actually doing what the species needs, which many times correlates to acres of habitat on the ground.
Great. So I'll jump in with a question while I'm waiting for others to form chats or unmute. Can you talk a bit about the American burrowing beetle, how they incorporated landscape factors? You mentioned the importance of landscape factors in your presentation. Yeah,
so the beetle, they basically took an approach where they looked at the quality beetle habitat. You know, you had your larger habitat area, which is most of eastern Oklahoma. Within that, you had some higher level, you know, high quality habitat, and they assigned ratios based on what you were impacting. You know, and they did look at the landscape in the sense of, you know, what is the habitat? The beetle is kind of a generalist, right? I mean, you know, usually species need grasslands, they need forest. I mean, the beetle can live in a lot of areas, and, you know, where we see some of the most productive habitat is kind of, we call cross timbers habitat, where you have grasslands with moderately sized trees and canopy cover. You do have to maintain those for carrion species, et cetera. But that's generally how it works, you know. So the industry folks could either send their consultants to the field, look at presence absence, calculate the credits off that, go to the market, get the best price or work with a supplier they want, do the transaction. Proof of that goes on their permit as well as our banking instrument. The service blesses it and their liability is transferred to us. That's kind of how the beetle market worked.
Great. I would like to open it up for others.
There's a lot of smart folks on here. I see all these names. Come on.
Okay, I've got a question from Adam Rigsby. Can you share more with us regarding mitigation standards? Specifically, how, by whom, and when, relative to a listing, are they established?
Yeah. So Adam, I would encourage you to jump in and give us your opinion as well. Again, what we're trying to do is determine what this, when there's a species that's in a tough spot and there's regulatory realities coming or there's already a species already listed, what does that species need? Let's get the conservation plan going, maybe even the recovery plan up front, but I realize that that's difficult sometimes. And then let's define those mitigation standards. And that would be things like, what do you have to do to qualify a mitigation site? How many surveys for presence absence? What sort of veg analysis? What sort of data record search, satellite? All the stuff that you do to determine if that site's going to be there. So that's what I mean in terms of setting the mitigation standards. What sort of endowment? All those things will be set in the standards, and ultimately the service would decide what they are. But the idea would be you have qualified stakeholders up front that can opine to the service their view of what they should be, versus just having someone needs a permit for housing development and they show up and they say, hey, here's some HCP and I'm gonna contribute $100 to TNC over here, and that's my mitigation, right? So you gotta try to get the standards up front, and whoever wants to play can come later, but they know what the rules are. I don't know if I got all that, Adam. Does that cover your question?
Yeah, Wayne. Just curious. I appreciate that, and just curious how you see the role of the states in a pre-listing environment playing into that.
Yep. So good question. The states are going to be involved. We've all heard no daylight between the feds and the states, right? The challenge is, how do you involve them such that, as I would call it, the biologists can do their jobs? Because what I've seen with the states, and again, I'm not trying to get on waffle or the states or anything, it's just trying to be objective of what's happened, and there's third-party reports out there that if you want to read, form your own perspective. But the politics seem to just ramp up, at least in these states, which are mostly red states. It's not as simple as, hey, Mrs. Biologist, what should we do about this species? The biological literature and the field investigations suggest this is a conservation strategy, and you do it, right? It doesn't work that way right now. What happens is there's typically lots of pressure that come in from industry. They don't want to pay what it's going to require to meet the standards, to deliver the conservation benefit in most cases. So then you wind up the consultants and the lawyers, and God bless them all, but you get these highly politicized, very complicated programs, and the wheels just fall off after 5 to 7 years. So the states need to have a role. Absolutely. I don't have the magic formula about how you depoliticize it, but we need the state biologists at the table.
Great. Any other questions or comments? I think that's it's a fascinating insight, Wayne, and because I've jumped into this more from the biology side. I mean, are there ways to make sure the biologists lead more? I'm just trying to think. There's a species status assessment process. Mm-hmm. That's usually you don't have time to do that before.
Yeah.
I think maybe in the ABB, I think they did have that prior, or I don't know, but
well, they usually ideally do every 5 years, and they did do one before they downlisted the beetle. That's correct. Yeah.
Right. So that helped quite a bit, help the biology lead. I'm just trying to think of ways to insert within the process.
Yeah, I don't really have a magic answer here, man. It's, you know, at the end of the day, you're dealing with folks and people, and you know, where this stuff gets, like I said on the opening slides, when you get these high profile political species decisions, you just kind of, a lot of the science gets squeezed out of it. And it's real unfortunate. And a lot of times these solutions that, you know, promise to be the future of conservation, all this kind of stuff, you know, I mean, folks in our industry and many folks in the service and even the states and other NGOs on this phone, they you know, there's a group of institutional knowledge out there that knows what works and what doesn't work. And it just seems like that in these high profile contentious cases, that institutional knowledge oftentimes gets pushed to the sideline, and you get some half-baked political thing that was done with some level of good intention, but it just buys time, you know, for those who don't want to really pay the true cost to conserve or restore the species. And then, you know, then the litigation starts, and it's just not really a positive trajectory.
Great. Okay.
Okay. I see another question here.
I guess, you know, I'm going to ask I'm going to take up a lot of space unless I get more questions. Oh wait, we get one?
We got one, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, can you talk a little more about the effort you're working on IRBA to put together a recommendation? So I'm a member of IRBA, as are other members of, you know, my partnership on these species. And, you know, we're going to be working with IRBA and going to them with some proposed language soon, as well as working with some of the key NGOs. We know they're working on their own effort, and everybody's very excited about mitigation. And, you know, we think we've got a good team. It's many people beyond me that have watched this issue evolve, you know, for decades and decades, and learned all the lessons from a lot of parts of the country. And we hope that our initial straw man or draft of a rule that we plan to share soon will be, you know, of interest. And we obviously are open to comment and feedback. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, Wayne, how's it going? I wanted to just jump in, and I won't hijack or pivot too much to IRBA, but I did really appreciate the question, Marlene. And, you know, I think at this stage where we see an important role for an association voice is going back and looking at the 2016 policies, looking at the 2008 rule, and figuring out what are the tidbits that are really important and foundational that we want to carry forward into this species rulemaking effort. Where are the lessons learned? Where are there also opportunities for improvement to maybe do it better now that we have that chance to be introspective and look back at the 2008 program? So it's very preliminary still, obviously waiting for further direction from Interior, but appreciate that question, Marlene. And, you know, happy to talk with anyone that's interested in as we get further down the road later this summer on that process. So thanks so much, Wayne. This has been a great presentation. And thank you, Doug, for putting it together.
Yeah, thanks for the help. Any follow-up on that? So I've got one more question. I'm just curious, you know, you talked about, you know, the uncertainty in the market, right? So if there are credits left, are there examples of like foundations or nonprofits buying remaining credits to make net investments towards recovery?
I'm not aware of any. I tend to kind of Southern Plains, a little bit Midwest, partners or Mid-Atlantic. I know that Travis suggested that maybe there's be some sort of federal grant to buy these stranded assets so people would be less reluctant to invest in the first place.
Mhm.
I'm not aware of any, another thing we're thinking about, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call are thinking about is, 30 by 30 could be a tremendous opportunity for many of us. But we got to figure out, what's the 30 by 30 credit so we don't get into this, all these mixed standards like we've seen here in these markets that have messed them up. And we got to figure out an income stream outside of regulatory compliance. I mean, ideally, there's a world not too far away where someone goes invest a bunch of money to develop I'll call it a conservation bank, but it could sell credits to the regulatory needs and also probably sell more credits because there'll be more demand if structured properly to meet the 30 by 30 goals. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres on private lands. You've got to have some funding mechanism for that. I think beyond Farm Bill and maybe some sort of conservation tax credit or something. We're looking at a number of things. I recently engaged Epic on this, and they've got a huge network of folks, and we're looking at all sorts of ideas to see which ones might stick and work or not. But if you could ever do something like that, man, it could really change it, because a lot of these areas that have high biodiversity you're competing with traditional development, right? I mean, I'm trying to save a species in, outside of Atlanta somewhere, and, maybe compete against the next housing development. And it's, this is why the species have lost, right? You go back to my initial slide, you've got to be able to pay for these precious resources with a market-based solution for the landowner that owns it today. And you can't just rely completely on goodwill and nonprofits. They've done a tremendous job of what they have, but to go from saving hundreds of thousands, maybe a few millions acres a year, to tens or hundreds of millions over 10 years, I mean, you've got to get the private sector involved.
Yeah, the 30 by 30 would be a great opportunity. Hopefully it's not just a moonshot. Hopefully we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
I got another question here. So what's your suggestion for how to determine whether an entity is a professional mitigator? Are there certain standards or specific qualifications that you think should be met? We work with a variety of partners in our conservation banks. Some of our sponsors are mom and pop landowners, while others might be consulting firms with a large portfolio of banks. For easement holders, we look to things like the LTA, Land Trust Alliance standards, to determine whether an entity is qualified. So what's your suggestion for evaluating?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had that, same question myself. I mean, I've competed with ginormous mitigation providers that, have lots and lots of capital and names that you've probably heard of. And I've competed with folks that are mom and pop, and they just happen to have a wetland on their farm, and hey, what the heck, let's give it a go. I don't know that you can define a standard for that. If Sarah wants to jump in, great, but it's like anything else, right? At some point when you start a new business, you're kind of green, and you're an entrepreneur, or you decide to work for a corporation as a green person. And I don't know how you create additional standards or costs to be, quote, qualified to be a provider. I don't know, Sarah, got any thoughts on that?
We've had this conversation to an extent. We've also had the Army Corps ask the question in the 404 context for when they're evaluating MBIs from new sponsors. There's been a question of, could there be a role for a third-party nonprofit entity to go and kind of run some sort of certification program that would say, you've done X number of banks or prior projects, but it's a really interesting topic that's still evolving. And yeah, it's good that it came up here and open to feedback from folks on the idea of a certification program. See, Adam popped in.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's a great question, and you can't hold 0 projects in a portfolio against somebody. Everybody's got to have the first shot. Especially in a small industry like this one, where it's an industry that's actually suitable to a bootstrap operation. So I try not to judge anybody on the zero in their portfolio, but you can look at their track record of experience, maybe not as a mitigation sponsor or conservation bank sponsor, but in the field. You know, are they qualified? Do they understand all the pieces and parts? But do keep in mind that in terms of conservation banking and in terms of mitigation banking, really, you have nothing to sell until you put everything into it. That includes the permitting, the approvals, the money in the bank to fund the endowments, the conservation easement on the property. So if you're at a point where credits are viable, then that's all you really need to know. Now, if it's a risky project, of course, and you're counting on some sort of long-term availability of credits, then yeah, maybe some more due diligence is due. But if it's a simple transaction, if the credits are there, they're good, and you know, that banker is compliant.
Yeah, I think Adam's right. I mean, the skill set to do this, you got to have a really diverse skill set. You know, it's legal, it's financial, it's conservation, it's biology, it's policy, it's politics. And, you know, you've got to, unless you have a piece of property that is legitimately, that you already own, that legitimately has all the attributes, there's really not a cost to quote find or develop it. It's a tough business. I mean, because of the uncertainty, mostly we've talked about, but you know, you got to have some runway. I mean, these species markets are not, I mean, I know there's some folks out there look at bankers and, oh, you know, they're greedy and make all this money. Trust me, man, this is not a get rich quick scheme. It's a very difficult way to make a living. There has been some good years and bad years for all of us, but it's, you got to have staying power and a lot of institutional knowledge to make it work.
Great. Well, that's awesome. I feel like that's a great place to end. And thank you for the simulating topic and discussion, Wayne. And thank you all for logging on. And hopefully we'll see you next month. And I'll be sure to update the marketing to get everybody who logged on today. And we're always looking for ways to share this information. So as you receive the email, please share it with others and help us grow. And if you'd like to give a presentation, please let me know. Wayne, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.